Okay, thanks very much for being here, everyone. Welcome to this talk on the golden age of Russki Rok. I'm happy to see some CLI students, alumni, faculty, members of the Melikian Center community, and maybe even people further afield, maybe from the NYU community. I myself did my graduate work at NYU, so welcome to all of you, welcome to everyone. We're so pleased to have with us this afternoon Michael Misha Danilin. Misha received his MA from the Russian and Slavic department at NYU in 2008, but he's been teaching at NYU since 2006, and his NYU story goes even further than that. But he's works as a preceptor in such courses as Russia between East and West and Russia since 1917. He also teaches Russian. And in addition, he serves as an expert in Russian rock, doing occasional lecture series and hosting other experts' talks on related subjects. He also runs this very popular semi-annual talk/music event called Kvartirnik, which for those who don't know means like apartment concert at NYU, and hosting both local bands as well as artists with Russian ancestry, as well as some Russian celebrities. Outside of academia, Danilin is deeply involved in music. He writes, sings, and produces for several different projects in the US and abroad, and runs two bands of his own based in New York, Interzona, an alternative electronica band, and MD and the Healers, a reggae and world fusion beat. So again, we're very glad to have Misha with us today. I know he's very excited to give this talk and present you with lots of interesting information and ideas, as well as some footage that he has to share. So please join me in welcoming Misha to CLI and to ASU.
Okay, in the beginning, let me share the slides, the screen. Okay. Okay, can everyone see the slide that says Russki Rok? Great. Okay, first off, thank you for the wonderful introduction, Irina. And yes, I am very excited to be here with you. Let me first mention that this talk coincides with two important anniversaries. First off, this year marks the 40th anniversary of the Leningrad Rock Club, the very first official rock music venue in the Soviet Union. And second, this particular date, June 21, one of the reasons why I chose this date for the talk, well, the reason why I chose this date for the talk was because today is Viktor Tsoi's birthday. And Viktor Tsoi, if you guys don't know, was the leader of Kino, the most important Soviet Russian rock band. So, and also for these two reasons, and for the sake of, time limitations, I will focus strictly on the golden age of Russian rock today, and I will be speaking exclusively about the bands from St. Petersburg today. So now let us begin. Some years ago, I worked with Professor Elliot Borenstein as a preceptor for his NYU World Cultures course, Russia Between East and West. One of the main ideas behind it was that any culture is largely based on its myths. And studying these myths, as they were conveyed by the contemporary culture's representatives, allows us to see the way they perceive their home culture and themselves as part of it. And in turn, come closer to understanding the culture itself, the way it appeared in a corresponding period of time. So in that sense, the idea of Russki Rok can be viewed as a myth. But let us first ask ourselves, what does the very term mean? Is it rock music made in Russia? Or is it rock music with Russian lyrics? So even if we stop right there, there's already plenty of room for confusion, given the recent geopolitical developments. For decades, calling Russian anything and anyone coming from the Soviet Union and post-Soviet territories would pass us just fine. But such is not the case any longer. Today, we're very likely to find ourselves in a situation when it might be perceived as not just inaccurate, but outright politically incorrect. But the real confusion doesn't even begin here. A Westerner might find it difficult to understand, but to a person residing in the post-Soviet territories, including Russia, or a scholar of Russian studies well familiar with Russia's obsession with its own identity, this opens doors to much broader myths, ideas, and interpretations that are rooted very deeply in the Russian culture and history. You can call it a conflict between East and West, Europe and Asia, Slavophiles and Westernizers, globalists and isolationists, while the underlying idea, or rather question, will still be pretty much the same. Does Russia have its own unique way, making it separate from both East and West? Or is it a part of the global society, sharing its culture, history, and its very social cultural system of values with the rest of the civilized world? Now, narrowing it down to Russian rock. Can this be viewed as a part of the global pop culture originating in Russia, or Soviet, or post-Soviet territories? Or is it some sort of inherently different kind of music, social, and cultural phenomenon with certain distinguishable characteristics that set it completely apart from its Western counterpart? There's, of course, more than one factor contributing to this. But if we consider the above outlook, it's going to become somewhat clear why some musicians in, modern Russian underground music subcultures call Russian rock говнорок, which translates as shit rock, and its stalwarts говнари. Well, that translates as the shitters. And as opposed to the other ones, the Russian rock musicians, the ones that call their music Russki Rok and glorify it as the only style possessing this particular Russian soulness. If you're interested to learn more and read Russian, please check out the Russki Rok article at Lurkmorye. Please check out the slides. Lurkmorye is an informal Russian language online encyclopedia focusing on internet, subcultures, folklore, and memes. So if you read it, I think you'll find it very interesting, and it will give you a better understanding of this conflict and how it came to such an extreme. Well, now, as I hope we begin realizing the full weight of the load invested in the term Russian, even if only dealing with rock, let us come back to the idea I introduced in the very beginning and start approaching it as a cultural myth. The time frame of today's discussion is from the 80s to the early 90s that are regarded by many as the golden age of Russian rock. However, it is worth mentioning that back then the very term Russki Rok didn't even exist. I know of only two contexts when it was likely to be used back then. By the foreigners, the lucky few who were able to witness the burgeoning underground Soviet rock scene of the 80s, such as, for instance, Joanna Stingray. And by the underground journalists who used the term for the new underground Soviet music to set it apart from Western rock on the one hand, and from the officially endorsed bands called VIAs, which stands for Vocal Instrumental Ensembles. If you guys didn't know, in the Soviet Union, even the word rock was prohibited. So they would call the officially endorsed bands VIAs. They came up with a special term. Apart from those and maybe some other equally marginal instances, neither the musicians nor their fans in the Soviet Union called their music Russki Rok. To them, it was simply rock in its many forms, such as post-punk, new wave, hard rock, heavy metal, folk, rhythm and blues. Well, you get the idea. So in that sense, the term Russki Rok was not coined until about a decade later, on the verge of 1990s, 2000s. When it was used as an umbrella term to create convenient packaging for all the protest music of the 80s in an attempt to monetize on it. Very briefly, here's the timeline of related events. In 1996, one of the major Russian record labels, Moroz Records, originated the new series Legendy Rusского Рока, the Legends of Russian Rock, releasing compilations of classic Russian rock of the 1980s. This is when the term Russki Rok embarked on its journey to popular consciousness. In 1998, there have been founded Nasha Radio FM radio station, aimed to promote Russian rock bands, as opposed to pop and Western music, as it follows from their very release statement. The word Nasha translates to English as our, and in their many slogans and jingles, they keep on emphasizing on everything ours as opposed to theirs. This is when Russki Rok was first officially defined against its rivals. Finally, in the year 2000, Brother 2, the sequel of Alexei Balabanov's Brother film, came out, which soundtrack consisted of the songs by the 4 representatives of Nasha Radio's roster. This film, according to many, both symbolized and solidified the new trend, rising national consciousness in light of disillusionment with American dream, the trend that we see culminating today in 2021. At about the same time, the early 2000s, there appears a new breed of Russian musicians proudly calling their music Russki Rok. Now, let me play for you the famous scene from Brother 2, the one in which the protagonist, Danila Bagrov, delivers his statement of truth to an American kingpin businessman Menace while holding the letter at the gunpoint. In his monologue, which he performs after killing Menace's aides, Danila asks the businessman that he refers to as Amerikanец, American, if power really comes from money. Danila himself believes that power lies in the truth with the capital T. He, Menace, is rich but not strong, as he took the money from someone else. Thus, the tricked person is right, so he's stronger. The entire monologue is performed in Russian, while Menace, apparently not understanding a single word, just sits there too scared to say anything.
Вот скажи мне, американец, в чем сила? Разве в деньгах? Вот и брат говорит, что в деньгах. У тебя много денег, и чего? Я вот думаю, что сила в правде. У кого правда, тот и сильней. Вот ты обманул кого-то, денег нажил, и чего, ты сильнее стал? Нет, не стал. Потому что правды за тобой нет. А тот, кого обманул, за ним правда. Значит, он сильнее. Да?
So, what does the above perspective tell us about the contemporary Russian culture? Well, there is no short answer to this question, and in any case, it lies beyond the scope of this presentation. Today, I will focus on the 80s. Back then, Russian-speaking underground musicians viewed themselves as part of the global music culture, trying to use whatever limited means that were available to them to plant the seeds of rock and roll in the virgin Russian, or Soviet back then, soil. Unity is probably the best word to describe it. The above-mentioned differences did exist already in their rudimentary form, but the fundamental vector in the development of Russian rock culture was directed to the West, reflecting the sentiment that prevailed in the Soviet society in general. So, let us throw a glimpse at that exciting time and some of its most notable representatives. The following decades took a toll on their lives, sometimes carrying them as far apart as to the different sides of barricades, quoting Mikhail Barzykin from the band Televizor. But back in the 80s, they were still together, in figurative, if not the literal sense, comprising the very core of a vibrant underground youth subculture.
Поиски контакта, поиски рук. Я начал песню мне уверен, это не вдруг. Я пишу стихи для тех, кто не ждет ответов на вопросы. Я пою для тех, иду своим путем. Я рад, если кто-то понял меня. Мы вместе, мы вместе, мы вместе, мы вместе. Мне не ясен взгляд тех, кто устал, мне непонятен тот, кто спит. Я не принимаю языка столбов, и мне не интересен лишь. Я люблю такое, составить день, а ночью видно ложь. И если кто-то думает так же, как я, мы с ним похожи ночь в ночь. Мы вместе, мы вместе, мы вместе, мы вместе.
It was the song "Мы вместе," translated as "We Are Together," by the band Alisa, performed at the Leningrad Rock Club Festival in 1988. Alisa was formed in Leningrad in 1983 and is still active today. This song comes from the album Energia, released in 1985. The song conveys the above-mentioned sense of unity that was so in the air back then. As the lyrics translate, I sing for those who follow their own path. If somebody thinks the way I do, we are identical, we are together. During the first years of its existence, Alisa's style was very progressive, borrowing from various current influences, from post-punk and new wave to rap and heavy metal. Towards the mid-90s, it was gradually becoming heavier, leading more and more towards classic hard rock, and with an addition of an electronic edge, much in the vein of a well-known German band Rammstein. It has been the sound of Alisa ever since. One of the most popular Russian rock bands, Alisa was one of the first to break out, gaining stadium-strong audiences since the late 80s, early 90s. Its core audience is now the youth from big cities' outskirts and suburbs, proudly calling themselves the Army of Alisa, that is notorious for their rough behavior during and after the band's shows. The leader and the songwriter of the band, Konstantin Kinchev, the living personification of the famous triad sex, drugs, and rock and roll, was baptized in 1992 and became a devoted Christian. And he's still an active propagator of Orthodox Christianity in Russia. He is now a devoted Russian nationalist, calling for unity of Slavic peoples and insisting that Russia belongs to neither Europe nor Asia, but has its own unique way. Also, he is famous by his open anti-gay stance. Such are the changes undergone by one of the most progressive Soviet rock bands of the 80s and its leader, Konstantin Kinchev, whose fairly conservative religious patriotic shift is viewed unfavorably by some old fans that liked Alisa for their original rock message. Still others are put off by his anti-Semitism. Among other things, he has referred to the protocols of the Elders of Zion as the official source, credible source, I mean. Nevertheless, Alisa is still active today, being one of the most popular Russian rock bands. The next in our presentation is Aquarium, also from Leningrad, with the 1987 song that is now viewed as one of the anthems of Perestroika, "The Train in Fire." As one of the first lines of the song goes, "We've been at war for 70 years. They taught us that life is a battle. But according to the latest intelligence data, we've been fighting against ourselves." Now let me play you a video. This is one of the first Russian, well, Soviet back then, rock and roll video clips.
Полковник Васин приехал на фронт со своей молодой женой. Полковник Васин созвал свой полк и сказал им: пойдем домой. Мы ведем войну уже 7-10 лет, нас учили, что жизнь это бой. Но по новым данным разведки мы воевали сами с собой. Я видел генералов, они пьют и едят нашу смерть. Их дети сходят с ума от того, что им нечего больше хотеть. А земля лежит в ржавчине, церкви смешались с золой. И если мы хотим, чтобы было куда вернуться, время вернуться домой. Этот поезд в огне, и нам не на что больше жать. Этот поезд в огне, и нам некуда больше бежать. Эта земля была нашей, пока мы не увязли в борьбе. Она умрет, если будет ничьей, пора вернуть эту землю себе.
Boris Grebenshchikov, who started his band Aquarium in Leningrad back in 1972, is widely considered a founding father of Russian rock. He was not the first to start writing songs with Russian lyrics, but he, along with his friend and fellow rock musician Mike Naumenko, the leader of Zappa, set out to create nothing less but the Russian rock and roll poetic language, thus paving the way for the entire new generation of musicians. Along with sound engineer, producer, and rock enthusiast Andrei Tropila, they created a new trend of magnetoalbumы, translating as magnetic or tape albums. The now legendary recording Antrop Records was an illegal enterprise functioning from one of Leningrad's young pioneer centers, where Tropila ran the sound recording club for youth. So what they were doing for the first time, they were recording real concept albums of underground Russian rock bands. And of course, back then it was absolutely unthinkable to officially release any form, rock music in any form, save Russia. Finally, at the end of the 80s, Andrei Tropila works his way up to becoming a director of Leningrad branch of Melodia, the only record company existing in the USSR. That's when the albums by the likes of Aquarium, Kino, Alisa, Televizor, Zoopark, and many others were first released officially as vinyl records. But back to Aquarium, the band is still active today, and it's still very popular. Even though Boris Grebenshchikov always made it a point to stay aside from politics, he is well known by his criticism of the latest developments, such as Russia supporting the war in Ukraine and participating in it. He is one of the very few Russian musicians having toured in Ukraine since 2013. To conclude the part about Aquarium, some time ago, Boris Grebenshchikov, himself a devoted Christian, made a statement at one of the concerts condemning the Russian Orthodox Church officials for taking part in state affairs and openly supporting aggression, such as the war in Ukraine. The next in our presentation is Zoopark and its leader, Mike Naumenko. One of the earliest representatives of the golden age of Russian rock, they were responsible for nothing less but laying the foundation for this cultural phenomenon. As I already mentioned when speaking about Aquarium, just as his friend Boris Grebenshchikov, Mike was consciously working on translating the vibe, and groove of Western rock and roll to everyday realities of Soviet life, to create not something peculiar or exotic, but fresh and new and yet very familiar, so Western and yet so Russian, as alive and vibrant as it gets. The featured song is called Blues de Moscou. Don't ask me why the title is in French. It's playing on the renowned cultural opposition between the two Russian capital cities, Leningrad and Moscow. As the lyrics go, no one likes us here and we don't like them too. Everyone rides metro, but we're not like that. We take a cab, even though we're broke. We drink our own port and somebody else's cognac. I don't like Taganka. I hate Arbat. So pour up one more and let's hit the road. In case you guys don't know, Arbat and Taganka are the names of major Moscow streets. And the video I'm about to play was taken at the festival of the Leningrad Rock Club back in 1989.
Почему-то москвичи ее любят больше всех. Эта песня называется «Блюз за Москву». Здесь нас никто не любит, и мы не любим их. Ты есть тут номер трудно, а мы не из таких. Ага, мы берем мотор, хотя в кармане голяк, и выкидаем свой портфель, выпьем чужой коньяк. Я не люблю Таганку, ненавижу Арбат. Еще водой наливай, и пора назад. Их нас никто не любит, и не садят на плечи. Не выставляют, и не готовят на момент, но всем ответ живым кайфом, как ломают кругом. Стокгольмный высоты, один крутой облом. Холодная гавка, здесь очень не бумаг. Еще по одной наливай, и пора назад. И барышня столица, милый, но не для нас. Стране не любят музыкантов. Ему сплошные отказы, не один магазин, телеграфный выдавает перевод. И не куда укрыться, когда газоль его. И спорт за штанины, глядит мой голый зад. И еще по одной наливай, и пора назад.
Zoopark was formed in Leningrad in 1980, although Mikhail Naumenko has been active as a musician since at least as the second half of 1970s, playing bass and or guitar with various bands, Aquarium being one of them. Unlike most of his fellow rock music lovers, he always named the Rolling Stones, not the Beatles, as the main source of his inspiration, the others being Bob Dylan, Mark Bolan and T-Rex, and a rock and roll of the 1950s. Naumenko went to a high school specializing in in-depth studying of English language. Therefore, not only he appreciated the vibe and groove of Western rock and roll, but was actually able to understand the song's lyrics. And by the way, Boris Grebenshikov also went to a special English language studying school, so he was able to understand the Western rock and roll's lyrics as well. Mike was mainly interested in a dirtier, rougher edge side of rock and roll and rhythm and blues. Thus, it's no wonder that he wholeheartedly embraced punk culture, the first signs of which appeared in the Soviet Union in the late 70s, early 80s. Later on, he became disillusioned with punk movement and distanced himself from it. Nevertheless, any Russian punk musician would probably name Mike Naumenko and his Zoopark as one of the main influences. While most of his rock and roll contemporaries were somewhat obsessed with morality in their message, Mike's songs sounded like they were written in day-to-day conversational language, feeling like snapshots of daily life without any slightest attempt to make it brighter than it actually was. Ironically, one of the co-founders of Russian rock as we know it today, and one of its brightest stars from the very beginning, Mike Naumenko was, in a sense, never able to reap the harvest from the seeds that he helped planting. At the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, when some Naumenko's colleagues were already playing stadiums, Zoopark has always been and stayed an underground band. In 1991, after he accidentally fell down on his way home from a party, Mike Naumenko died as a result of a fracture of the skull base. I have no knowledge of whether Naumenko ever appreciated songs by Soviet bards, but it would seem that their legacy didn't leave much of a trace in his lyrics. So, if we agree with the popular idea that one of the essential characteristics of Russki Rok is to continue Bart's tradition, then Zoopark never played it. Nevertheless, the force of their impact on the phenomenon of Russian rock is undeniable. Zoopark, who never made it to the mainstream, paved the road for the entire new generation of Soviet rockers of the 80s, 90s. Coming up next is arguably the most important Russian rock band and one of such musicians, largely influenced by Naumenka and his Zoopark and Aquarium, is Kino, also from Leningrad, with another song that is now considered Perestroika anthem, the 1987 "Хочу перемен," translated as "I want change." As the chorus goes, our hearts demand change, our eyes demand change. It's in our laughter, our tears, the pulse in our veins. Change. We're waiting for a change. This video features the closing scene of the film Assa that came out in 1987. The very first one featuring Russian rock music and the very moment when Kino, already an established underground collective, broke out to the mainstream.
Вместо тепла зелень стекла, вместо огня дым. Из сетки календаря выхвачен день. Красное солнце сгорает дотла, день догорает с ним. На пылающий город падает тень. Перемен требуют наши сердца. Перемен требуют наши глаза. В нашем смехе и в наших слезах и в пульсации вен. Перемен. Мы ждем перемен. Электрический свет продолжает наш день. Коробка от спичек пуста, но на кухне синим цветком горит газ. Сигареты в руках, чай на столе. Эта схема проста, и больше нет ничего. Все находится в нас. Перемен требуют наши сердца. Перемен требуют наши глаза. В нашем смехе и в наших слезах и в пульсации вен. Перемен. Мы ждем перемен.
The band leader Viktor Tsoi had always been very skeptical towards using the songs of Kino in any kind of political context. He didn't like discussing the meaning of his lyrics, always noting that it's just as tasteless as explaining the meaning of a joke. But he did mention freedom, as in one's inner freedom, making them independent of ever-changing circumstances, and the importance of preserving oneself as opposed to satisfying a certain image or fitting in a certain criteria imposed by the others. Back in 1981, when Kino was founded, their style was a blend of early 80s neo-romanticism and beat music of the 1960s. However, starting with around 1984 and on, they were leaning more and more towards new wave, especially its colder and darker side, which trend continued after Tsoi's tragic death in a car accident in 1990, on the very peak of his band's fame. Even though the band stopped existing, its legacy continues to this day, gaining more and more new fans, some of which weren't even born yet when Tsoi died. The minimalistic, almost sparse, to the point approach that Kino used both in their lyrics and music was in perfect accord with what was going on in the world's pop culture at the second half of the 1980s, making their songs easily accessible by millions on the one hand, and containing all the important elements making them current rock music of world-class quality on the other. Here's an interesting story that came up several years ago, having to do with Viktor Tsoi and his legacy. A deputy of Gosduma, the lawmaker Evgeny Fyodorov, made a statement that the song that you just heard, I Won't Change, was written for Viktor Tsoi by the CIA operatives as a part of the larger operation aimed to destroy the Soviet state. One of the best responses to these allegations was the line from another Tsoi song, Muraveynik, Anthill, posted online as a comment by one of Kino's fans. This is how it translates. I don't know what percentage is crazy right now, but if you trust your eyes and ears, it's a lot more than before. Tsoi's son Alexander filed a legal complaint against Fyodorov, accusing him of slander, but I have no knowledge of further development of this story. There are a couple of things worth mentioning to conclude the part about Kino. First, the last several years saw the song I Won't Change keeping on resurfacing during various protests, both in Belarus and in Russia. Its universal, not to say existential, longing for freedom and change expressed with such sincerity and such energy by one of the most charismatic Soviet rockers during the time of Perestroika, the time that is still strongly associated with change in popular consciousness, ensured its relevance and longevity for the generations to come. And second, the new Kino lineup, featuring all original surviving band members, added by the young players, has been rehearsing for a year and already started touring. Their shows are essentially large-scale music and multimedia happenings with musicians playing live to the recordings of Tsoi's vocals, with concert videos, photos, and animations serving as a backdrop. Well, I wouldn't say nothing like that has ever been done in the world before, but at least I don't know of anything like that ever happening before this. They actually played to the recording of his vocals, and there is a microphone in the middle of the stage, the empty microphone. They are very impressive. There are recordings on YouTube. If you guys are interested, please check them out. We don't have time to do it today. The next in our presentation is another band from Leningrad, Televizor, with the song with telltale title Syt po gorla, translating as fed up to the neck. As the song lyrics go, they would stuff me up to the neck, but don't eat if you don't like it. One of the benefits is that you can beg all you want. Still, that is all you're ever going to get. It's pointless to think of what's to come. If you're weak, you weren't properly fed. There is nothing for me to ask for. I'm certain that I'm satiated. I'm full, fed up to the neck. And the video is also one of the first Soviet rock music video clips.
Доброе утро, я снова здесь, мне ничего не надо, у меня все есть, я гуляю по кухне, с гордым видом и имею основание считать себя сытым до сытости. Это не голодный, чего у меня нет, да все что угодно, открываю холодильник и во взгляде колбасы, я чувствую уверенность в том, что я сыт, я сыт. Сыт по горло, лай-лай-лай-лай-лай, сыт по горло, лай-лай-лай. твой, а впрочем, ты можешь и не есть. И если не хочешь, то и заключается одно из преимуществ. Сколько ни проси, другого не получишь, и не стоит думать о том, что дальше. Если ты слаб, ты ел мало каши, мне нечего желать и нечего просить. И я твердо убежден в том, что я сыт, я сыт. Сыт по горло, лай-лай-лай-лай. Сыт по горло, ла-ла-ла-ла-ла-ла-ла.
Televisor was formed in Leningrad in 1984 and is still active today. Its style is not easily definable as it borrows from various current influences, but it has always been leaning towards darker electronic side of new wave music. However, before I start talking about Televisor and its leader Mikhail Barzykin, it's probably time to step aside and say a couple of words about Leningrad Rock Club and to shine some light on why so many Russian rock bands are from Leningrad. The Leningrad Rock Club was a historic music venue of the 1980s, situated on Rubinstein Street in the city center. Opened in 1981 and overseen by the KGB, it became the first legal rock music venue in Leningrad and in the USSR in general. Overall, it was the largest rock scene in the Soviet Union and the only place where such bands as Aquarium, Kino, Alisa, Televisor, Zoopark, and many others were allowed to perform without any repercussions. In order to receive a permit for a performance, though, each band needed to submit their lyrics for the approval by the club's committee. The goal was to keep the youth culture in check to prevent its more controversial manifestations. However, by giving musicians a place to meet, perform, and discuss their music, the club provided for an unprecedented amount of creative freedom and helped lead to the Russian rock revolution. The club effectively closed in 1991. So back to 1986. When preparing for their performance at the next festival of Leningrad Rock Club, Televisor submitted the song's lyrics to the committee, and some of them were not approved. Nevertheless, Barzykin decided to perform the controversial songs, resulting in Televisor being dismembered from the club and their performances being banned until 1987. This story illustrates the position that Mikhail Barzykin has always kept unchangeably. His uncompromising, oftentimes radical words and actions have cost him a great deal. Unlike many of his fellow rockers from the same era, he did not become a part of mainstream music establishment, effectively returning to underground after the initial wave of interest towards rock music was inevitably washed out by the countless new commercial pop projects. As his colleagues are still monetizing on their legendary status, which was built during the years of perestroika when rock was the officially proclaimed music of protest. Televisor, the very essence of protest in any imaginable form, has now only limited club popularity. Barzykin's bitter lyricism condemning all kinds of ugliness in human nature, his openly aggressive stance against music managers and producers of all sorts, and his unwillingness to compromise even the slightest bit for the sake of being more successful commercially, resulted in him being almost forgotten, comparing to such grandees of Russian rock as Kino, Alisa, and DDT, his equals in fame back at the end of the 80s. And of course, the active part that he takes in anti-Putin opposition doesn't help that either. Revered by some, condemned by many, he, in my opinion, is the very personification of the idea of staying true to oneself, both in his music and his life in general. Well, this concludes our today's presentation. What I was hoping to illustrate is back in the 80s, in its golden age stage, Russian, or to be precise, Soviet, rock didn't have too much in common with the very idea of Russki Rok that dominates the popular consciousness today. Yes, you can easily trace searching for national self-identity in the works of many Russian rockers of the 80s, as it is very typical for Russian culture or any culture in general at some point in its development. However, in my opinion, it is very important to remember that any form of nationalism, xenophobia, and bitter opposition to the West were never typical for this culture back when it was born. 1980s and early 90s were the time of breaking the walls and building the bridges. And Russian rock and roll culture, with its insatiable longing for freedom, was at the spearhead of these processes, both reflecting and speeding them up. Russian rock is said to be instrumental in bringing down the Iron Curtain, and it would be impossible to imagine back then that 30 years later the trend would reverse to the point that some named the new Cold War. And to make it even more absurd, that Russki Rok would serve as a reflection and an instrument of that. So, how far will the opposition of Russia with the West go this time around? And what form the force of freedom that's going to break the new wall in the making will take? Well, time will tell. I can only hope it happens in our lifetime. Thank you all very much.
Okay. My cat decides that he needs to talk to me. Sorry about that. Well, thank you, Misha, for that introduction to all of those bands. I hope that for some people this was their first introduction. For others, I hope you heard them. You've heard of them before and you enjoyed seeing them here, and enjoyed getting some like context of them in their early days, with a little bit of telescoping to today as well. So we have not too much time, but we have some time for questions. I'm open to either people raising their real or their digital hands, as well as if you would prefer to type your question in the chat and then I can read it for you. But thankfully we have someone with a hand up right now taking this opportunity. So Dave, please.
Hi, thank you, Michael, for this fabulous presentation. I really learned a lot, and I love that you gave us, a couple minutes to hear each of these songs, and you also, contextualized what these bands mean to Russians today, which is awesome. My curiosity the whole time was, I work in Turkey, and in Turkey, I just love the sort of national rock movement that emerged in the 60s and 70s called Anatolian pop or Anatolian rock. And there, an important aesthetic goal was to kind of find ways to blend Western rock sounds with endemic, like Turkish sounds, identifiably local sounding things, right? So in your talk, it seemed really apparent that there wasn't such a goal in the 80s for Turkish rock, but I'm wondering if are there examples of bands that have tried to kind of create a distinctively, recognizably Russian sound somehow, or Soviet sound, let's say, and has that maybe become more popular more recently? What can you say about that?
Thank you for the great question, David. Yes, today I did focus on the more, how would I say, I wouldn't say pro-Western, but the bands that sounded more Western, just to illustrate my point, that back then there was no such opposition as we are witnessing today. But yes, of course, they were Russian bands and musicians, which can be roughly defined as like Russian folk rock representatives of sorts. For instance, Alexander Bashlachov, a big, he's very famous. Unfortunately, he died in 1988 or 1987, if I'm getting this right. And a lot of Russian musicians say that he was the only true Russian rocker. He would incorporate a lot of elements of traditional rock music in his songs. Also, the band called Nol, translated as zero in Russian, and its leader, Fyodor Chistякov. He is a bayan player. A bayan, if you guys don't know, is a Russian button accordion, the traditional Russian instrument. So by the very definition, he was playing Russian rock, if there is such a phenomenon. Some some would even, just like about Alexander Bashlachov, some people say that Fyodor Chistikov is the only real Russian rock. But even Aquarium at some point, at like in the early 90s, was leaning towards, I wouldn't say traditional Russian folk sound, but at least experimenting with it, with incorporating that elements in his songs. So these are, and there are some other examples as well. So yes, this phenomenon did exist, and it's still out there.
Great, thank you. I look forward to try to dig up some of these on the internet.
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have time to speak about this kind of bands today. Maybe next time, if there's another talk, I will do it. I will cover Nol and DDT and other more Russian sounding bands. Let's put it this way.
Great. So would anybody else like to pose their question or try to solicit some more information? Well, in that case, I do have a question. So for some of these musicians, you kind of talked about their own trajectory and what they kind of believe or what kind of public figures they have become, and the way that fans in some cases have sort of followed this trajectory, and in other cases feel like this trajectory is a betrayal of earlier earlier beliefs or earlier convictions that the bands represented for them. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that tension a little bit more, what happens when, I think maybe the guy from Alisa being a great example, right? Them feeling like this was a band that was, sort of dedicated to openness and togetherness, and then now feeling like this person has come to have a very exclusionary idea of what it means to be part of the collective. So yeah.
Great question. Thank you, Irina. Actually, I appreciate this opportunity to talk a little bit in a little bit further detail about Kinchik and his position, Alisa. I don't want you guys to fall under conclusion that he is like he's serving the needs of a Russian state. Let's put it this way. In fact, Kinchev doesn't consider himself a Putin follower. And I think in near Putin circles, the feelings about Kinchev are fairly mixed as well. Even though he is a propagator of Orthodox Christianity, even though he's a devoted Russian nationalist, with all the side effects that I already mentioned, I won't go over them again. In my personal opinion, he can be roughly compared with the Slavophiles, the part of Russian intelligentsia that originated back in the 19th century. Like back then, there was a renowned opposition between two groups of Russian intelligentsia, the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. When Westernizers believed that Russia was a part of Europe, etc., whereas Slavophiles thought that Russia has its own unique way. So in a sense, Kinchev is continuing this tradition. But the problem, in my opinion, is that it really requires some knowledge of the subject in order to really understand what he's talking about. However, his core audience now, as I mentioned, is big cities, outskirts youth, calling themselves the army of Alisa. I seriously doubt that many of them are familiar with what Slavophiles were back in the 19th century. So when Kinchev calls for the unity of Slavic peoples and insisting on that it's time for the Russians to rise up, stand up from the knees, they just go and start beating people of Caucasian descent, truly believing that that's what he wants them to do. Of course, I'm oversimplifying things now, but it's a complicated situation. Despite everything that I said about Kinchev, he is a very his creative persona is very big. And the reasons why he's still very popular is not because he just started to follow the state doctrine. And recently he launched a new album. As of the fans' feelings and reflecting on all those changes, yeah, you can get the first-hand impression from me personally, as I am one of such fans. Well, but how would I answer this? If I had my own preconceived ideas about what Alisa stood for, and they just kind of changed their face, maybe maybe it's me that's a problem, not Kinchev. I don't think he like owes to his fans to fulfill the image of his created by created in well in the early 1980s. So I like I said, I don't want to paint this in black and white. I just I would like to keep it open. If you have any further questions, just ask them.
Okay, I think we probably have time to hear from one more person. Jack, I saw your hand, so.
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. One question I had, and I don't know if there really is an answer or not to this, but we talked about music specifically in St. Petersburg today during this presentation. But what was this Russki Rok phenomenon like across Russia, specifically in not majority Slavic regions, if there was a phenomenon like that, and how is it different or how is it similar?
Okay. And again, my apologies that I only focused on St. Petersburg bands today. I already explained my reasons. Yes, St. Petersburg was the first to create their own Lenin rock club. I think Moscow was the second to follow. In 1985, they created their rock laboratory. And Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, was the third at around the same time. Other Russian major rock capitals are Omsk in Siberia and also Novosibirsk. Mostly those are thought to be the capitals of Russian punk rock. As of the non-Russian republics, the biggest that I am aware of was the rock club in Kiev, Ukraine. It was open, I believe, in 1988. It was like the last one out of this spree. How was the music different? Again, this is my opinion, but I think that Ukrainian rock of the late 80s were closer to new wave and avant-garde and experimental forms of rock and roll, as opposed to traditional rock and roll, which was still big in, say, St. Petersburg. At least one of the reasons is that, like I already said, it was only open back in 1988, like towards the late 80s, and the new wave was the prevailing music form, rock music form back then. Moscow rock and roll. Interesting. When I did a talk with Jana Stingray, she said something interesting. She said that some Moscow musicians, some unnamed Moscow musicians, would say that musicians from St. Petersburg are not true Russian rockers, period, because they are so influenced by Western rock, whereas Moscow is the place where real Russian rock and roll is made. I don't know how true is that, but there are definitely a lot of great Russian Moscow rock bands. If you want to check them out, I would suggest that you begin with Zvuki Mu. I will put it in the chat. They are whole. Okay. Do I have access to the chat? Anyway, Zvuki Mu is the name of the band with their leader Pyotr Mamonov. Okay, so that's not to make it more lengthy than it's supposed to be. That's the way I would answer it.
Right. I'm sure, Jack, you want to discover the great Russian rock or just rock legends of Tashkent, maybe. We'll have to save that for the next talk, however. I discovered like an all, God, where are they from? I mean, they might have been Uzbekistan, but like an all women's rock band from, gosh, maybe even earlier, because it was like all black and white, the recordings, but it was like, it was a banger. They had bangers. It was amazing. But we have come to the end of our session today. I just want to thank Michael Danilin once again for presenting on a topic that is clearly both of academic and kind of as a musician of personal interest to him. That definitely came through in the presentation. And thank you to all of our audience members for being here and for listening. So my round of applause. We've got a lot going on this week. For those of you who are CLI students, we have a session on grant writing tomorrow. Wednesday will be our Balkan, BCS and Macedonian Culture Night. And of course, hope to see you back here Thursday for Hilda Hogenboom's talk on Catherine, the life and legend of Catherine the Great. So everybody have a great rest of your Monday. Thank you again to Michael, and have a good day.